Assyria was mainly a nation of serfs who were attached to the land that they farmed. They could be sold along with the real estate. They owed allegiance to the local village. The village, in turn, was tied to a city by the obligation to pay taxes, participate in religious festivals, and obey administrative mandates. The cities, chief among them were Ashur, Nineveh, Erbel, and Nimrud, were under the authority of the king. In theory, the Assyrian king possessed absolute power in all aspects of government: economic, diplomatic, political, military, and religious. Although acknowledged as human, he was thought to be the earthly delegate of the gods, especially of Ashur, the principal deity, who was represented by a winged disk. Because of that status, the monarch was aloof from other mortals. Only the superintendent to the palace had regular access to his presence. Even the crown prince was allowed audience only when omens were deemed auspicious. And outsiders were blindfolded when they appeared in court before their ruler. For the king, satisfying the gods was no easy task. He was constantly subjected to such arduous rituals as fasting or retreating for a week at a time to a crude reed hut. Sometimes the omens indicated the gods were direly displeased. The most evil sign was an eclipse, lunar or solar, which was taken to portend the death of the monarch. In such cases, the king abdicated his throne temporarily in favor of a surrogate, who assumed responsibility for whatever had angered the gods. At the end of 100 days, the real king returned, and both the substitute and the substitute's wife were executed, presumably to give the gods the death of the king that had been foretold. The Syrian kings and their subjects believed that they were surrounded by hordes of demons, as well as gods. Among the most odious and fearsome was the fever demon Lamashtu, female spirit who specialized in killing infants and women in childbirth. She was seen as a fiend with a lion's head, teeth of a dog, legs of a panther bearing eagle claws. She was believed to roar like a leopard while clutching writhing snake and suckling a pig and a black dog to her pendulous breasts. Such monsters were able to penetrate the bodies of both virtuous and wicked humans, thereby causing all the woes with which people were afflicted. Fortunately, Assyrian demons were considered on the whole a doltish lot. With the help of a priestly exorcist known as an ashipu, they could frequently be duped into turning their malevolent attentions to a sacrificial animal. A chronicler related how, with an ashipu presiding, a sick man would share his bed with a goat kid overnight. At dawn, the demon who caused the man's illness, mistaking the goat for a human, would leave the man and enter the kid. At this point, the kid's throat would be slit and the man would be cured. Demands of the gods and onslaughts of demons put restrictions on royal authority. No Assyrian king would consider making a major decision without consulting a host of priests, oracles, exorcists, diviners, astrologers, and soothsayers, who in effect became powers behind the throne. These religious functionaries were enthralled by the culture that Babylonia inherited from ancient Sumer. The Assyrians, whose own heritage was primitive, fervently believed that what was old was good and must be preserved. Innovation, dangerous, and should be avoided. Assyrian thought, religious and otherwise, was permeated by that aversion. Of the hundreds of Assyrian gods, most were of Sumerian origin. Ashur, the chief native deity, took on attributes of Sumer's principal god Enlil and Babylonia's Marduk, even while the two divinities were revered in their own right. Assyrian law was based largely on the code promulgated in the 18th century BC by Babylonia's King Hammurabi. Assyrian astronomy, along with mathematics required to support it, reflected the Babylonian interest in the heavens. Many Assyrian scribes were trained in Babylonia and remained faithful to the Babylonian model in their literature. Like the Babylonians, Assyrian artists tirelessly depicted military exploits of their kings, although Assyrian sculptures also devoted original talent for rendering scenes of the hunt, the favorite sport of Assyrian monarchs. During a single expedition, Tilgath-Pilser I slew 4 bull elephants, 4 wild oxen, and an astounding total of 920 lions, or so the Assyrian scribes relate. The Assyrians' main intellectual pursuit was collating the knowledge already accumulated by Babylonians and their Sumerian predecessors. A great library the Assyrians built at Nineveh was filled with cuneiform tablets containing compilations of Mesopotamian religious rituals, prayers, omens, incantations, and curses, along with exhaustive lists of gods, heavenly bodies, minerals, trees, foods, household furnishings, and virtually every other subject to which ancient Mesopotamians had turned their attention. Only in the art and science of warfare did the Assyrians display any great interest in new techniques. Their immense armies, sometimes numbering as many as 200,000 troops, eventually were divided into 4 branches. The light infantry was largely manned by archers with powerful composite bows constructed of glued-together wood, bone, and other materials. Heavy infantry, the shock troops, wielded bronze spears and swords. Chariotry was gradually giving way to cavalry. As the newest branch, cavalry underwent several experimental stages. At first, cavalrymen were little more than highly mobile archers, each accompanied by a mounted attendant who held the reins of his master's horse, while the archer dismounted to unleash his arrows. Later, the shield-bearing attendant rode alongside and grasped the reins of both horses, while the archer fired at a gallop. Finally, as their skills matured, archers rode and fought alone as true cavalrymen. The Syrian army could march 30 miles a day along roads, some of them paved with stone, that had been constructed throughout the empire by military engineers. The roads also proved an invaluable communications network. Couriers on relays of horses could carry messages to any part of the empire and bring back answers within a week. Even where there were no roads, the tough Assyrian soldiers advanced relentlessly. One prideful monarch said of his pursuit of an enemy through the mountains, "I led the way like a fierce wild bull with my picked bodyguards and merciless battle troops. I traversed wadis, torrents, ravines, and dangerous slopes in my sedan chair. Where it was too hard going for my sedan chair, I took to my feet and went on in pursuit to the high peaks, like a gazelle." Once in battle, the Assyrians asked for and gave no quarter. They rejoiced in the butchery. "I cut their throats like sheep," recorded a king. "My prancing steeds plunged into their welling blood as into a river. The wheels of my battle chariot were bespattered with blood and filth." Military aggression was confirmed by Assyrian religion. Conquest was the divine mission of kings, claimed one monarch. "Ashur, father of the gods, empowered me to make broad the boundary of the land of Assyria." All the kings harked to the militant mandate. By the start of the 9th century BC, and the reign of Ashurbanipal II, the Assyrians were again marching to the west. While carrying Assyrian arms to the Mediterranean for the first time in 200 years, Ashurbanipal waged a campaign that would eclipse the dread deeds of his forebears. "I caused great slaughter," he boasted. "I destroyed, I demolished, I burned. I took their warriors prisoner and impaled them on stakes before their cities." After sacking one city, Ashurbanipal stacked the corpses of the dead like firewood outside the gate, and then flayed the nobles, as many as had rebelled, and spread their skins out on the piles. After another battle, in which he killed 3,000 soldiers and took many prisoners, he reported, "Many of the captives I burned in a fire, many I took alive. For some I cut off their hands to the wrist, for others I cut off their noses, ears, and fingers. I put out the eyes of many of the soldiers. I burnt their young men and women to death." This was something new. To be sure, the Middle East was inured to horror. The Assyrians had indulged in atrocity before. Now and henceforth, however, the region was confronted by a succession of Assyrian kings who, by deliberate design, practiced and proclaimed mutilations, flayings, impalements, and other atrocities for the purpose of spreading terror and thereby encouraging submission. By savage irony, that policy was from first to last a dismal failure. Time after time, hardly had the main Assyrian army withdrawn from a vanquished nation, leaving behind the mangled citizenry, then revolt flared. To dilute and disperse the potentially rebellious populations, Assyrians hit upon a debilitating expedient. They shuffled conquered peoples around the Assyrian Empire on a massive scale, both to obtain forced labor and security. Some civilians were taken to the Assyrian homeland, where they were put to work as artisans or as laborers on farms and public projects. Others were transported to lands that, like their own, had been depopulated by Assyrian deportations. In a renowned instance of the relocation policy at work, the Bible laments that after the Assyrians conquered Samaria, a province of Israel, they carried off the Israelites to Assyria, and the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in Samaria instead of the people of Israel. In time, the Assyrians came to depend on the conquered populations. To support their military ventures, they dragooned entire enemy units into their armies. After King Sargon II built a new capital, Khoraspad, in 713 BCE, he wrote that he had settled it with peoples from the four quarters, of strange tongues and different speech, dwelling in the mountains and in the plains. As many as 4 million people may have thus been shifted about the Assyrian Empire during the last 3 centuries of its existence. And so, with coiffed beards and bloodied hands, Assyrian kings marched in grisly procession across the Middle Eastern stage. In 745 BCE, a king named Tilgath-Pileser III captured Aramean Damascus after a brutal campaign. That ended the military threat of the Arameans, who thereafter, to the benefit of themselves, the Assyrians and the Middle East as a whole, then turned their energies almost exclusively to trade. So ubiquitous were their traveling traders that Aramean became a kind of lingua franca of the ancient Near East, understood and spoken by people throughout the region. A few years later, in 721, the Syrian king Sargon II put an end to a major annoyance from the bothersome kingdom of Urartu, which had been formed by consolidation of old Nari tribes and for nearly a century been pressing in on Assyria from the north. Assyrian morale suffered severely during the hard campaign into Urartu's mountains, wrote Sargon. The harassed enemy of Ashur, who had come a long way, very weary and slow to respond, who had crossed and recrossed sheer mountains innumerable, of great trouble for ascent and descent, their morale turned mutinous. I could give no ease for their weariness. Unable to rely on his main body of troops, he met the Urartians in a narrow defile with only his personal household cavalry. Standing in his battle chariot, he led headlong charge. The stunned Urartians retreated, at which the main Assyrian army took heart and fell furiously upon the enemy, forcing them into a rout in which great numbers died of exposure in the mountain cold. Sargon II's successor, Sennacherib, lavished loving attentions on the city of Nineveh, which he took as his capital and beautified with a splendid park. He described it as being like Mount Amanus, wherein were set all kinds of plants and fruit trees such as grown in the mountains and in Chaldea. Yet, for all his aesthetic sensitivities, Sennacherib was a true Assyrian ruler, achieving a remarkable reputation for cruelty that contributed to his downfall. He sacked resurgent Babylon in such utterly ruthless fashion that he incurred bitter enmity of the durable pro-Babylon faction within his own country, which had him assassinated by 2 of his own sons. Another son, Esarhaddon, then avenged his father by shattering the regicide's army and seizing the throne for himself. I am Esarhaddon, he proclaimed, king of the world. But he was careful to atone for his sacrilege of his father. He rebuilt Babylon, symbolically molding a brick with his own royal hands.